3,000 ducats. 'Tis a good round sum. 3 months from 12. And let me see the rate.
Well, Shylock, shall we be beholding to you? Shall we be beholding to you?
Senor Antonio, many a time, and oft in the Rialto, you have rated me about my moneys and my usances. Still have I borne it with a patient shrug, for sufferance is the badge of all our tribe. You call me misbeliever, cutthroat dog, and spat upon my Jewish gabardine, and all for use of that which is mine own. Well then, it now appears you need my help. Go to then, you come to me and you say, Shylock, we will have moneys. You say so, you, that did void your room upon my beard, and foot me as you spur a stranger cur over your threshold. Moneys is your suit? What should I say to you? Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats? Or should I bend low and in a bondsman's key, with bated breath and whispered humbleness, say this, Fair sir, you spat on me on Wednesday last. You spurned me such a day. Another time you called me dog. And for these courtesies I'll lend you thus much moneys.
I am as like to call thee so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too. If thou wilt lend this money, lend it not as to thy friends, for when did friendship take a breed for barren metal of his friend? Lend it rather to thine enemy, who, if he break, thou mayest with better face exact the penalty.
Why, look you how you storm. I would be friends with you and have your love. Forget the shames that you have stained me with. Supply your present wants, and take no doit of usance for my moneys. And you'll not hear me. This is kind I offer. Go with me to a notary, and seal me there your single bond, and in a merry sport, if you repay me not on such a day, in such a place, such a sum, or sums as are expressed in the condition, let the forfeiture be nominated for an equal pound of your fair flesh, to be cut off and taken from what part of your body pleaseth me.
Content. In faith, I'll seal to such a bond, and say there is much kindness in the Jew.
What you're asking is there reasons for Antonio to hate Shylock that have nothing to do with his Jewishness. He's vengeful. He takes delight in creating this bond that will allow him to inflict death on Antonio. So he's definitely a villain in the play. I don't see him as having necessarily any redeeming characteristics. He's a bad guy in the play who's humanized in certain ways. He's monstrous, but he's being given human motives for what he's doing. But so is Iago, right? Who's discontent because he has not been given a promotion, and he wants revenge. And so he manipulates the situation to get revenge. So I think there are reasons. And I think the fact that he is a moneylender, that he presumably may have, based on his actions with Antonio and the bond he insists upon, treated others in that way, right? That we could make that argument. I wonder whether or not Antonio could have as freely spit upon Shylock's gabardine if he were not Jewish. Right? What if he were another Christian who was lending money out in this way and was cruel and that people had reason for hating? Would he get away with that? So I still think that Shylock's Jewishness matters in terms of Antonio's ability, to spit on him, to kick him, right? And that Shylock's response, right, when Bassanio asks for the loan but promises Antonio as the one who will provide collateral, right? That Shylock is never sympathetic, really, except when he presents himself as somebody who has been victimized by the Christians in ways that he describes and that we can see as plausible. So yeah, he's a villain. If take away the Jewishness, right, and you have a very plausible villain who not only has been loaning money at high rates of interest, but who is also vengeful when we see him in this situation, and then could be vengeful in other situations as well. His servant is eager to get away from him. Lancelot basically complains that, I've got to get away from this guy. There's a farce with him debating with his conscience, right? He's loyal. If he's loyal, he'll stay, but the devil urges him to go. And what the passage is really saying is that Lancelot is debating about how he's been mistreated and how he's got to get away to have a better master who feeds him better and so forth. So there, And presumably he has circumscribed Jessica's life in ways that are harmful to her, that are cause her suffering and pain, right? And that's implied as well. Going back to that theme of the father, right? If we talk about that, the father's authority, Shylock is more of the limiting patriarchal figure in the play than Portia's father, in reality, right? And is similar, his reaction, Shylock's reaction, for instance, to, the often quoted, right, my ducats and my daughter speech, which is not even directly reported of Shylock, but is indirectly reported, and therefore suspect as well, because it may not be exactly what Shylock says, but simply what is reported from a very prejudiced perspective of what he said.
It is often repeated as if Shylock had said it. But that forgets that, as you point out, in Shakespeare, there are numerous instances where someone repeats what we just heard being said, and they repeat it differently. He even, I think, is it in Henry IV, Part 2, that opens with the character of rumor. Mm-hmm. This was one of his themes, reporting accurately or inaccurately, narrative that you can trust and that you can't trust. And so that could have been a bit. That could have been shtick on their part, a little routine that maybe they've done all their lives about,
Right. It could be your typical biased caricature. Why wouldn't it be? Since all the Christians seem to view Shylock in that way. And why, more importantly, since Shakespeare could have every opportunity, if he wanted to do it dramatically, to have Shylock present that directly, the same way he has fathers in similar circumstances in other plays directly report their woes, right? So that Aegeus in Midsummer Night's Dream, he gets to directly, report his view, and then in Othello, Desdemona's father gets to have a similar hysterical response, and then in Much Ado About Nothing, Hero's father has a similar hysterical response to, and readily believes what's said of his daughter without even doubting that the rumors are true. But it's not a direct quote of what Shylock says. So it's all doubtable.
It's not as if Shakespeare spent a career making villains of Jewish characters. He basically only has these two, and I have to include Jessica in this idea of someone that it's very hard to like. It's one thing that you understand that she wants to get the hell out of there, and she does. She's not going to do it with his permission. She's doing it with a Christian, so she's eloping, and they they throw a little party that he's invited to, and he says, "I won't go out of love, I'll go out of hate," or something like that. But it's another that she steals the ring that her father's fiancé gave to him before they were married. My turquoise, he calls it. I had it of Leah before we were married. That's profound spite, and that's not about money. That's about taking something that Dad values and then trading it for a monkey.
Yeah, right.
So
and she has to know what it means to her father.
Yeah. So what's that about? I mean, that's
it's hard to say, right? I mean, the play doesn't delve that much into Jessica's inner life, right? She's not a fully drawn character, right? She says very little, really, that tells us what her motives might be in doing that. But it seems like there is quite a bit of antagonism towards her father. I mean, it might just reinforce the way Shakespeare wants to present Shylock as a villain, right? Even his daughter hates him, right? And this is what she does because she despises him so much and wants to hurt him. But there's no real description or insight into her motives there, is there? I can't remember.
We don't hear it from her.
We don't hear it from her or anybody else. Yeah, we just hear from Shylock how hurt he is by losing that ring because it has a sentimental value to him, which may be more about humanizing Shylock, who, for all his valuing of wealth, here points out that what really pains him about losing that ring is that he had it from his wife before they were married.
And he basically disowns her after that. I would rather she were dead. And he even says with the gold or the ducats at her feet, let her be dead. I would rather have that than to have had the money. When I saw it once in Oxford with Leo McKern, during that scene, he tears open his doublet and the buttons go flying across the stage as a representation of, I mean it. I'm finished with her. I would rather I had never had her as a daughter. It's fascinating to me that in terms of this question that constantly arises, if you play Shylock more as a villain or if you play him more as a victim, to what degree does it affect the anti-Semitism of the play? To what degree does it make it more or less anti-Semitic if it's about the characters being anti-Semitic and Shakespeare is revealing that and he's representing it from a compassionate point of view? Is the play anti-Semitic? Is he anti-Semitic? Are they all anti-Semitic? It just seems to me that post-Holocaust, the definition of what it is to be anti-Semitic is so drastically different from 400 years ago when there were maybe a few hundred hiding out or alleged conversos in London, and Shakespeare may never have met them. He appropriated the caskets. He appropriated the entire story of Shylock, the moneylender. It's not even his idea. And one of the things that we remember about what he injected into it is Shylock's representation of what it is to be hated as a Jew. And yet it still was somehow, we have to fine-tune our time machines to find out whether Shakespeare himself was anti-Semitic according to what it would mean 400 years later. Is that being unfair, I think, to Shakespeare?
No, I think that Shakespeare is very interested in how the existence of hated outsiders undermines the common good. So that Shylock is like Edmund in King Lear, who, because he's a bastard right? Because he's a bastard, becomes this destructive figure. Iago is disappointed about the promotion. He's a careerist. He wants to advance his career. He gets passed over for promotion. He becomes this destructive force. Othello is an outsider whose outside status allows Iago to burrow into his insecurities and cause him to become hysterical in a way that spurs him on to murder his wife. There are other examples, right, of people in the position of outsiders and how and they testify to how they feel about that. Right, and I think Shylock is one example of that. I mean, yeah, I think you're right that post-Holocaust Shylock cannot be played comically. It's impossible and irresponsible even for someone to allow in a performance or even teaching the text not to deeply delve into these things and address them. But I think that the play sustains such readings. Having taught it recently and trying to think about it deeply, obviously it's troubling, and it's something that has to be, fully explored and noted. There was anti-Semitism and other kinds of ostracizing in Shakespeare's day that had murderous consequences, and he had to be aware of that. And so in some sense it's not different. I guess for me the question is, what does Shakespeare do with outsiders? How does he use the existence of these cultural others in his work to ask questions, to undercut those cultural paradigms in ways that are really interesting? And one example, one of my recent thoughts about the play was how different Shylock is in Act 1 and 2, when he's able in his interpersonal relationships with characters to express the motives, right? Express the reasons why he feels the way he does, right? Of course, the prime example is the often quoted "if you cut us, do we not bleed" speech, right? Where he's basically defending his humanity, right?
There I have another bad match. A bankrupt, a prodigal, who dares scarce show his head on the Rialto. Let him look to his bond. A beggar that was used to come so smug upon the mart. Let him look to his bond. He was wont to call me usurer. Let him look to his bond. He was wont to lend money for a Christian courtesy. Let him look to his bond.
I am sure if he forfeit, thou wilt not take his flesh. What's that good for?
To bait fish withal. If it feed nothing else, it will feed my revenge. He hath disgraced me and hindered me 500,000, laughed at my losses, mocked at my gains, scorned my nation, thwarted my bargains, cooled my friends, heated mine enemies. And what's his reason? I am a Jew. Hath not a Jew eyes? Hath not a Jew hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions, fed with the same food, hurt by the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer as a Christian is? If you prick us, do we not bleed? If you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And if you wrong us, shall we not revenge? If you are like us in the rest, you shall resemble us in that. If a Jew wrong a Christian, what is his humility? Revenge. If a Christian wrong a Jew, what should his sufferance be by Christian example? Why, revenge. The villainy you teach me, I will execute, and it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction.
It's interesting, though, when we get to the courtroom scene, when Shylock is asked for his reason for wanting to take the pound of flesh, to have his bond, he doesn't give the real reason. He actually says, I don't have to tell you. There are often inexplicable reasons why someone dislikes somebody else, right?
Some people don't like the sound of bagpipes.
Yeah, right.
Some people
exactly.
don't like the smell of such and such.
Yeah.
So it's his way of saying that it happens to be my preference, and I don't have to tell you, I don't have to know, because it's in the bond.
Yeah.
I have the law on my side.
And he says, my reason, just say it's a natural dislike and leave it at that. What matters here is the law. So, but the interesting thing is that he doesn't give his reason. Maybe he can't give his reason. He's in the court. I guess the question for me is, why in the earlier acts can he provide very plausible explanations that are psychologically plausible? He wants revenge. He's been mistreated, right? In the earlier acts, you can talk about the psychology of victimization, right? You can talk about the fact that Shylock has been mistreated, and so he wants to mistreat those who mistreated him without even considering them as individuals. He just wants to hurt all of them. How can we not understand that today with school shootings and people motivated by similar sentiments? Maybe they feel they've been hurt so that they can randomly, destroy people's lives, right? We look at terrorism and things like that, right, where people feel they've been wounded, and so then they can respond in kind.
He even looks out at the audience and tells us, gives us 3 or 4 reasons, because he's a Christian, because he brings down usances.
Because he's harming my business.
And also, I owe it to my tribe. Yeah. So he's saying, so the 3 or 4 reasons, and he's clear about them. Yeah. And this is before he even engages with Antonio. He's telling us why he's going to behave the way that
and then in the
does.
court, in Act 4, never mind, just say I don't like him. Call it my humor, and we'll leave it at that, right? And then something else happens in that trial. When Shylock's called forward, over and over again, repeated 7 or 8 times over the course of not very many lines, 2 pages of lines, it's let the Jew come forward, let the Jew come forward, let the Jew, over and over again, right? And so suddenly he goes from Act 2 and 3, where he can testify to his humanity in some way and have a hearing, have it heard, to being the Jew, right, in the trial scene. And so he's silenced there. The real human motives and reasons are silenced. And I think that there's something about this that relates to tyranny. I'll call it the Christian tyranny in the play, right? That Christian values and Christian ideals have fully accepted sway, right? And dominance. So that anyone with an alternative point of view is most of the time effectively silenced. And I look at the passages where Shylock is speaking in Act 2 and 3, and I see them as strategies on his part to try in some way sort of shake the language, right? To get outside of the way he has been defined by it, right? And so it's almost, you think of any society in which you have some kind of prevailing prejudice, right? Racism is a form of tyranny, right? And in circumstances like that, the tyranny, the prejudice is embodied in the words. So how can somebody in that position speak and be heard becomes a real issue. And so I think that I see Shylock as using this situation as a vehicle for trying to point out their inhumanity, the inhumanity of the Christians and the tyranny of their system. And I think in Act 4, because it's a legal setting, he's silenced. the legal language, which think about reified language, right? That's where you get down to the nitty gritty of debating words, right? Where language can be most reified in legal documents, right? In that setting, he's completely ineffectual at being anything but the Jew. Even Gratiano twice repeats, almost as if he's just going to be marched off. Bring the halter. Right? He says that twice. Bring the halter. Hang him. Right? You look at that post-Holocaust, how can you not respond to that in some way and see that maybe Shakespeare is aware that this dominance of Christianity is a kind of tyranny, and that other voices are silenced in it. And he shows how the legal system reinforces the tyrannies of that system and doesn't allow the voices of those who are marginalized to be heard.
That point bears out especially in lieu of the fact that Portia's argument is just, it's bullshit. I mean,
it's a legal argument. It just plays with words.
And even from a strictly legal point of view, I've forgotten the word for the concept, but there are certain details that are understood. And so if it were to be a pound of flesh, you would never have someone denied their forfeiture on the basis of the fact that the pound of flesh would somehow have to exist in and of itself. No pound of flesh is without blood. So, and when she cites that somehow it's in the laws of Venice that any man who this and that, there are some renderings of it that I've seen where she actually shows him the book, which I think is wrong because she's making it up. I have an article in the Times from July of a couple of years ago where Ruth Bader Ginsburg participated in Venice in a mock reopening of the trial,
Really?
a kind of appeal. And after about 2 hours of arguments and about 20 minutes of deliberations, the judges issued a unanimous ruling to remove the question of the pound of flesh. Quote, "We agreed it was a merry sport and no court would enforce it. Justice Ginsburg said, to restore Shylock's property, to restore the 3,000 ducats that he had lent to Antonio, and to nullify the demand of his conversion." But Shylock doesn't say a word about any of that. He could easily have stood up. He's a man of the world and said, "You have to be kidding me. This is nonsense. Show it to me. Prove it. I am content." That's all we hear from him at the end. I am content. I'm not well.
He can't stand up any more than a black man under Jim Crow in the courtroom and hope to win.
So he put his trust in the law, but it's the system. It's sheer power.
And he's silenced by it. He's silenced by Christian tyranny, put it that way.
Well, the irony is that it's Portia who has impeached the justice of the state. That's not the letter of the law that they do.
Well, that's the other
him.
reading of the play. They're all hypocrites. The Christians are all a bunch of hypocrites. And the play ends with them self-satisfied that they've somehow granted mercy when what they did is the furthest possible thing from mercy. Right?
They force his conversion.
They force his conversion. They take away his estate. They grant half to the state, right, and half that is good to go to his daughter at his death after he's disowned her. The final moments that we see Shylock, he asked to leave. He said, "I don't feel well.
I don't feel well.
Can I go?" Right? To me, that could be perfectly parallel to any circumstance in which somebody who is marginalized in a given society by some form of prejudice is just beaten down by the system. And maybe Shakespeare's showing us that. On the other hand, maybe the final scene, the courtroom, is just reinforcing the anti-Semitic views of probably most of Shakespeare's audience, or all of them. And that we're supposed to believe that his conversion somehow is good for him because it saves his soul, right? That's the other reading.
A happy ending to his life.
Happy ending
now he's a
because
Christian.
he's converted and he'll be saved despite not wanting to be.
Well, whenever I see that scene, I can just hear the Globe cheering for what's being done in the same way that Bassanio, he's so delighted at Portia, what she's doing to him. And you can feel the audience rooting and jeering the way they must have when they framed and executed, was it Rodrigo Lopez, the Queen's physician? They framed him on some trumped-up charge. He was a Portuguese Jew who was allegedly a converso. And typically Elizabethan hanging and drawing and quartering. And he protested his love for the Queen. And they jeered and they mocked. I always think of that when I see that scene. They must have loved to see the Jew getting his desserts.
Even then, the fifth act is required to distance us from that moment, because that moment is clearly not comic.
Well, that's why I think throughout the 19th century, the actor-managers just cut out the fifth act because they just decided, well, with that scene, it's not a romantic comedy, so let's give that up and let's make it about this.
Yeah. No, the last act is dramatically necessary to make it a comedy, because there has to be distance created dramatically, which is why the whole thing with the rings is almost unnecessary, but really unnecessary, right? In terms of the fact that, Bassanio is married to Portia in Act 3. All the important matter of the play is finished in Act 4. But Act 5 is necessary dramatically to distance us from what's happened in Act 4, which, even if people are cheering, is not comic, right? It's something quite different. And so we need the romantic ending, that this little nonsense farce with the rings, and everybody's going to wind up happy, right? We return first to Jessica, right, with Lorenzo, and a little romantic scene playing out by moonlight, and then Portia returns, and we have the rest of the play, which helps, I think, the audience maybe not confront some of the issues that are left dangling at the end of Act 4.
Looking at it purely from a point of view of stagecraft, the trial scene is about as good as it gets. I mean, it's just perfect, and you can imagine the audience that's seeing that for the first time and has no idea what's about to happen. You can't follow that. I mean, he does. He tries to, but this little stunt straight out of a sitcom, it just can't compete with a guy who has to bare his chest and the knife is about to go in.
Yeah, right.
And in Shylock's defense, I would say that we do not know, and we'll never know, whether or not he would have done it. There were no stage directions. It's often done as if it's right at the skin, and then she says, whatever she says, hold a while or stay a while and so forth. For all we know, Shylock's revenge might have been that he was going to scare the living daylights out of this guy, and he was going to torture him with all of this anticipation in the same way that he's been tortured and threatened. It's possible.
We don't know. We don't know. Yeah, he doesn't do it. So yeah.
As a matter of fact, he does less to anyone insofar as what we see. Compare him to our hero Hamlet, who murders his girlfriend's father, who drives her to suicide, and at the end of the play, his mother is dead, his uncle is dead, he's dead. Horatio is lucky.
He arranges for Rosencrantz and Guildenstern to die. He effectively murders them.
Okay, and so the wonderful Hamlet has done a hell of a lot more than the villain.
No, he's not.
Shylock.
He's a killer. Hamlet. Yeah, it's often not noted how many people he kills, right? In his quest for revenge, even if it's one of the odd things about that play that where people describe how he can't act. He's busy. He's always doing things, which is the only thing I really liked about the Mel Gibson version, was that it was an action character instead of Hamlet sitting around all the time soliloquizing. He does a lot. Hamlet is very active.
And he's an agent for things to happen.
Well, everything that happens, more or less, except the murder of his father, right?
John, whenever I read Harold Bloom, I'm aware of the fact that he's the anxiety of influence guy, because he always talks about an author's predecessor and how they, to put it in Hemingway terms, they go into the ring with them and see if they can top them in some way.
Right.
And he does that all the time with Shakespeare in relationship to Christopher Marlowe, Jew of Malta.
Right.
Is there any remote comparison to what we have in The Merchant of Venice to what Marlowe was doing with the character of the Jew who poisons wells and goes out looking for children?
No, I don't think so. He's a rival, right? Marlowe's a professional rival. Shakespeare's obviously writing this play in competition, but I think the complexity of Shylock, I think Shakespeare does something entirely different, right? It gives us a reading of the play that is not so easily assimilated to anti-Semitism as Marlowe's play. He's interested in commerce as well. He's interested in what that means for changes to his culture, right? So I think those things often come up as points of conflict, and Shylock is just a convenient vehicle to present the commercial standpoint, right? But that's something that I think Shakespeare takes time from time to time in the play to point out, quite deliberately. And Shylock is often the vehicle of pointing out the hypocrisies of the Christians, that they are caught up in the same game, although at the same time there are confusions about value as well. And I think that that's apparent early on in the play when Shylock first encounters Bassanio and Antonio when they approach him about the borrowing the money. That encounter begins with Bassanio saying that Antonio is a good man. And then Shylock responds, yes, he's good in a different sense, that he's a good business risk. He's good for the money because he has collateral, right? Or he has kind of a history in commerce. So I think that confusion that begins that scene is actually really interesting, right? Because the Christians put forth a version of good that has to do with character. And Shylock has a version of good that has to do with commerce, right? And so initially, Shylock is kind of assimilated to the commercial view of things, where a man can be good if he's his credit is sound, right? If he has enough collateral to put up to be given a loan, right? The same way that somebody these days would be good from the standpoint of a bank loaning them money, right? The bank does not take testimonials of character, right? They take the credit score, right? And a person is good in those terms if they're a good risk, right? Risk. So Shylock initially is presenting that view that Antonio's a good risk. And Bassanio, on the other hand, says, no, he's good, he's a good man. And those two things are confused, deliberately confused. I think it's a way of dramatizing the way that those two things are in contradiction in Elizabethan England and the commercial city of London, right? That a person can be good in those two senses, right? A good man is not necessarily deserving of a loan, right? And somebody who is deserving of a loan is not necessarily a good man in the sense of virtue.
Well, I was going to ask you if there's a good comparison between the World Trade Center of the Venice that we see in The Merchant and Shakespeare's London. They were both lively and developing mercantile cities, were they not?
Yeah, the centers of capital, right? And what matters in that is the financial standing of individuals, right? In that context, their standing as human beings doesn't matter. There's a wonderful documentary that came out about 12 years ago called The Corporation, and it's it basically the point of view that the documentary departs from is that they're going to use the psychological criteria to diagnose the corporation as a legal person, right? So they go through the diagnostic criteria, right, systematically throughout the film, each checking off each of the each of the elements, the conceit of the film being, if the corporation is a legal person, what kind of person is it, right? And so the film concludes, after having gone through all the criteria and checked off all the appropriate boxes, that the corporation is a psychopath, right? And I think that Marx had a similar insight when he points out that under capitalism, all its solid melts into air, right? That there's nothing but the cash nexus, or the legally binding contract to hold people together in a commercial society. The values of the medieval period, the maybe shared Christian values or other kinds of moral values, are no longer of any importance in that economic system. And I think Shakespeare understands that, and that's why in this confusion that occurs between Shylock and Bassanio and Antonio, that we see that contradiction apparent. But we also see the Christians continuing to think of themselves as virtuous individuals in a moral sense, even as they are also caught up in those same contradictions themselves. And they can hide that from themselves by scapegoating Shylock, right, as the one who is caught up in the inhumanities of commercial society, if you will. It's one way of looking at it.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that scene where we first see Shylock.
Yes.
It's very cinematic because it begins in the middle, in a sense. We know that Shylock has already been playing with Bassanio and delaying, and throughout the scene he pretends to a lot of things. He pretends to not entirely remember what they are thinking about agreeing to. He pretends to not know the rates, which of course he knows. He does this all day. Let me see the rates, he says. He knows all of this. And it's interesting how astute Shakespeare is. There's no such scene in Marlowe, anywhere in Marlowe, where you have this understanding of commerce and the back and forthery of commerce, which is quite accurate, and it applies to what happens today. But at the same time, it's a revelation of character. Yeah. Shakespeare is telling you how clever Shylock is in finding out exactly how badly they need him. He's doing a Columbo in a sense. I don't know. I'm not sure. What did you say? Oh, I forgot. 3 months.
Yeah.
And even that speech that he allows himself, an actor playing Shylock could take that as a test. Let me try this out. I really don't need these guys anyway. Let me see how badly they need me. If I can call them out, as you said earlier, if I can call attention to the fact that they now need me after they've spit on me and treated me like a dog, do they still want me? Will they still stay? And then I'll know what kind of power I have over him. That's a lot in one scene between
very
three guys.
Very short scene, really, where it's all packed in there, right? They're all caught up in commerce, knowing what everybody else's standing is, right? It's like it's like Wall Street, right? Like where different companies stand. The person who's going to make the money is going to know minute by minute what stocks are rising, what stocks are falling, right? There's a repeated phrase throughout, what news on the Rialto, which is really, what's going on with the equivalent, right? What's going on in the stock market, right? Somebody who's watching it to try and make that profit at the end of the day. So of course Shylock knows everything, but so do they. And I think that's what they conceal from themselves, right? They're caught up in that same enterprise, and it's of concern for them as well.
Antonio is a good man. Bassanio, have you heard any imputation to the contrary? Oh, no. My meaning in saying he is a good man is to have you understand me that he is sufficient, yet his means are in supposition. He's got all these ships all over the place. I don't know if I can trust him. One more case of just testing to see how far Bassanio's endurance will go, and therefore to find out how badly he needs this money. He has never in his life had to stand there and listen to this from Shylock.
Yeah,
but he has to, right?
He has to, because they want to borrow the money from him. Yeah, he has to listen to it, right? But I think when Shylock does call them out, I think he is pushing them. He really doesn't need them. But he does push the envelope when he calls attention to the way he's been mistreated.
Money's is your suit? should I say to you? Should I not say, hath a dog money? Is it possible a cur can lend 3,000 ducats?
He's being pretty open, right, about how he feels about how they've treated him, and why should I give you anything? And they obviously are pretty desperate, because even after him openly calling attention to the abuse, they say, well, yeah, we'll still, Antonio actually responds, he says, yeah, and after you lend me this money, I'll still spit on you.
I am as like to call thee so again, to spit on thee again, to spurn thee too. If thou wilt lend this money, lend it not as to thy friends, for when did friendship take a breed for barren metal of his friend? Lend it rather to thine enemy, who, if he break, thou mayest with better face exact the penalty.
But then Shylock still agrees to lend them the money. I think he's trying to push the envelope to call attention to his victimization. I think he's finding these opportunities where there's possible vulnerabilities, where he can point out the injustice that's done to him. And they don't see it, even though he tries to wriggle out from underneath the stereotypes that they've imposed upon him, right? The kind of identity that they've imposed on him. I actually think he's trying to shake free the language a little bit and get out from underneath it. And they don't hear him. They just want the loan, right? And they'll accept the terms. And I think he plays around with that a little bit as well, when he says, well, I'll just do this to you as a kindness despite what you've done to me.
Because I want your love.
Yeah.
Of course he doesn't, but I mean, he
yeah,
might.
But he
But
he knows he's not going to get it.
Why, look you how you storm. I would be friends with you and have your love. Forget the shames that you have stained me with. Supply your present wants, and take no doit of usance for my monies. And you'll not hear me. This is kind I offer.
If you just gave me your love, I mean, what an interesting parody of Antonio's response to Bassanio, right? Everything that I have is at your disposal because I love you, right? And we're friends. And Shylock says, well, anything I had would be at your disposal if you love me.
Right.
And they won't.
Right.
Do they give a reason not to? Not really, right? Antonio just says, well, I'll spit on you again. Shylock gives reasons why he despises them. I can't think of reasons aside from what Shylock does that they give for why they despise him. And that's interesting, because they could, right? Shakespeare could have them say, well, no, we won't be friends with you because, right? But that never happens.
No. That's why I said, as an actor playing Antonio, you would need to write your backstory because it's not in the given circumstances.
No.
But it is interesting that Shylock tips his hand to the audience, if I can catch him once upon the hip, which is a term from wrestling.
Yeah.
If I can get them down.
Yeah.
And then I can have my revenge. And this is almost from the moment that they walk in.
He doesn't want profit, he wants revenge.
Yeah.
Right? And if we believe what he says, it's because of the way that he's been treated, right? Or mistreated. And that has, he does also give the reason that Antonio is lending money without interest, and that's harming his business, right? And then he gives the reason that it's because of, the hatred that his tribe has for Christians. All those reasons are presented, but it seems to me that the most prominent one is that he wants revenge because he's been mistreated. He's been victimized, and he wants to get them back for it.
When he's speaking to us, Shylock, he says,
Yeah.
I will feed fat, and I love this terminology, the ancient grudge I bear him. Now, in my experience, when Shakespeare chooses a term and it has power, which ancient grudge does, it always means more than one thing. Yeah. Ancient grudge meaning from the first time I had to have my dealings with him, but also ancient implies the history of anti-Semitism
Yeah, right,
to which he's
exactly.
been subjected, ancient grudge. That's no individual says that about himself.
Or the anti-Semitic view that Jews are after the blood of Christians.
the blood
The
libel.
ancient grudge
Yes,
could also be anti-Semitic, right? Not just the grudge I bear because of the abuse, the grudge I bear as an aggressor,
yes,
which would feed
right.
into the anti-Semitic image, right? I think in the business they're caught up with, and nobody can trust anybody. Where's the bond? I mean, the bond is repeated. Where's the moral bond that would intervene to prevent the legal bond from being enacted? That's one of the dramas of the play, right? The fact that the moral bonds that might prevent somebody from pursuing what Shylock pursues with Antonio, right? That pursuing his injury, don't exist in a commercial society, right? People can be injured in other ways, and it could be completely legal. So I think that's also something that Shakespeare is trying to dramatize.
Is it conceivable that, as frequently happens with a younger man who is handsome and charming, desired, loved by an older man of wealth, is it possible that Bassanio, who we know is at least in part wooing Portia for her wealth and for her kingdom, is it possible that he's been playing Antonio? I mean, you're talking about that no one can trust anyone. I'm not so sure that we can trust Bassanio and his relations with Antonio. He's a cash cow for Bassanio. Presumably, he borrowed from Antonio under the understanding that at some point he'd be paying it back. It is actually, from a Venetian point of view, it's a hell of a lot of money. He's not just borrowing some stray cash. He's building a retinue. He's buying a boat. He's hiring servants. There's probably a small orchestra that's going with him, and he has no way to pay it back. We have no sign that he has a job. Someone says that he was a good student and a good soldier. Nothing about an occupation. He's not at court.
There's no evidence at all that would recommend Bassanio's virtue, right? None. Except his friends, and they are self-serving as well, it seems to me. I mean, I think they're pretty self-serving in the praise that they give one another. They see themselves as virtuous. They don't question their own virtue. They're caught up in the same game of commerce as Shylock, but they like to see themselves as different and as valuing something else. But do we see them engaging in virtuous acts? I don't think so.
But when they steal Jessica,
That's
for
not
Lorenzo,
a
they
virtuous
steal
act, right?
when they steal his money.
Yeah.
That the money gets tossed down before,
Yeah, they're taking the
before
money
she
as well.
comes
Yeah.
out the window.
Yeah. This is all supposed to be good behavior. And they're breaking the law. Portia masquerades as a lawyer and doesn't reveal it. And somehow, because the good win, I guess we're supposed to accept that. But what she does isn't exactly virtuous there. So I think there are all kinds of things that that can make us look at the Christians in the play as hypocritical, as also self-serving in the way they praise each other, and there's evidence that they're pretty shallow and superficial folks as well. There are occasional speeches that have some level of eloquence to them, right? But they, that doesn't necessarily prove their virtue. There are plenty of villains in Shakespeare's plays who have eloquent speeches and make arguments that are worth considering.
That's a very interesting commentary for you to be making about what is allegedly a romantic comedy.
Yeah.
That's a hell of a lot of critiquing within the play on Shakespeare's part.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's a love story, the lovers are not beyond reproach.
I don't think they are. I mean, that's why a lot that The Merchant of Venice is sometimes characterized as a problem play, because it has these problems within it that are not necessarily fully resolved, that the characters themselves are not without fault, right? And can be viewed through other lenses.
Well, it's been said that in building the character of Shylock, Shakespeare's genius couldn't help but create a character that is beyond the concept of the play, that he's outsized for a romantic comedy. That, I mean, he's the guy. Anytime you think about The Merchant of Venice, I mean, Harold Bloom says, oh, it's Antonio's play. Well, perhaps for Bloom, but what's the first thing that an audience wants to know if there's a production in town at Lincoln Center or somewhere? Who's the Shylock? You know,
Yeah,
it's
well,
Al
Shylock
Pacino.
has become identified as the merchant, right? Even though it's clear that Antonio is the merchant, but that's an interesting conflation, right, of things, because I think there's an intended comparison between Antonio and Shylock, but also that their supposed difference is subverted throughout the play. There's a line in the first encounter between Antonio, Bassanio, and Shylock, where Shylock talks about how he basically calls attention to the fact that they are supposedly Christians, but they're as hard dealing in their bargaining as he is, right? And to me, that prefigures his later famous, if you cut us, do we not bleed speech, where he basically says that if I'm taking revenge, then I've learned this by your instruction, and I'm going to better it, and I'm going to better you and be better at what you do, right? I mean, he basically claims that I've learned to be brutal in this way. I've learned to be brutal in this way by following your example. Right? That's the real end of that. If you cut us, do we not bleed speech is that I'm going to better the instruction.
The villainy you teach me, I will execute. And it shall go hard, but I will better the instruction.
It's what you've taught me. I'm merely treating you in like kind to the way that you've treated me. And I'm going to treat you worse. So I'm going to get revenge. I'm going to treat you worse.
And that goes back to your concept of how the outsider does not participate in power in the same way that the presiding culture can. He would like it to be the case that what you do to me, I can do to you. But it doesn't work that way when you're the minority.
Yeah, they imagine they can, right? I mean, so they adopt aspects of the way that they've been brutalized, believing that they can beat the system by imitating it. Right. And what they usually manage to do is to destroy themselves and a lot of other people along with them. Iago imagines he's going to be able to cultivate himself, right? The image with Iago is a garden, right? That the self is a garden, and that he's going to cultivate himself in such a way that he's going to manipulate others and attain power, right? Edmund, in a similar fashion, right, sees that because he has had this indignity of inflicted on him, right, merely because by chance he happens to be a bastard. I think what these destructive outsiders do is that they wind up directing all their violence against the very system that has rendered them, put them in this abject position as outsiders, but they try to use the very structures or assumptions of the system to do it, and that's why they destroy themselves and a lot of others as well.
That's in line with Sartre's great biography of Genet, which is as much about Sartre as it is about Genet. And his argument is that what Genet did was to say, in effect, you've all called me a thief since I was a kid, and you've put me into reform school, and they put me into jail. Okay, you say that I'm a thief, I'll show you a thief. I'll show you 1,000% a thief. It's exactly what Edmund is doing in Lear, right? Stand up for bastards. You say that I'm a bastard, I'll show you them. I'll show you the most bastardly of them all.
Right.
And it's this idea that you can self-create, that you can self-identify, but do it as a reverberation of how you've been treated. And in Shakespeare, the revenge doesn't really, even for Prospero, he has all this power.
Yeah.
It really doesn't work very well at all,
Yeah,
does it?
in Shakespeare, self-creation is, I think, a delusion.
A delusion.
Yeah,
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think that if you look at all the instances where characters present this notion of Renaissance self-fashioning, right? This idea that was prevalent in the Renaissance, that you can fashion yourselves, that the self, that a self is a garden, that characters who take that seriously go awry, right? I mean, they may achieve in part their designs because they want to harm others who have harmed them, right? And they bring about an enormous amount of destruction, but they die in the destruction that they create.
It's even true of Hamlet, isn't it? Because he's not the kind of guy who wants to have to go after. I mean, it's one of the reasons why he perseverates for so long. He's not the kind of guy who's going to go after his uncle and put a knife to him, but imagines that he can create a Hamlet who can do that.
Yeah, and he can't.
But it doesn't work.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, it
he
doesn't
destroys
work.
himself.
Yeah, because there are forces, whether they're internal or external, right? The structures of society prove to be too powerful for any individual to fashion himself or herself within them, right? They provide limits to that. And a lot of these characters who reference that self-fashioning don't properly take into account the power of those circumstances. I think this is apparent in the history plays as well, that kings are also subject to those same forces. That it's a common lesson, in the histories, right? Is that even a monarch is human after all, right? Richard II, in Act 3 of Richard II, has that wonderful speech, right, where he, where he talks about, let us talk of tombs and epitaphs, right, and death sitting within the hollow crown, right, boring his way through the side, and then goodbye, king, right? It's a way of talking about mortality, but it's also, I think, also a way of talking about how kings are caught up in this inexorable process of history, or whatever you want to call it, that they, even with all their power, are still subject to it. So if kings are subject to that, ultimately, and we see that, for instance, in the whole Henry ad, right? That Henry, Bolingbroke and Richard II takes over with this kind of self-assurance that he can lead England, and then finds himself, right, in Henry IV, parts 1 and 2, where do we see him? We see him bogged down with civil war and strife that he's unable to overcome. And even Henry V, despite his triumph, Shakespeare's audiences would know that he dies a few months later. So Shakespeare's audiences would know what happens after that and the chaos that followed from it.
Well, where do we ever see a king really enjoying himself in Shakespeare? Richard III enjoys becoming. He enjoys the process, but he's barely king, and he's on the battlefield calling for a horse, and they're hunting him down like a boar. King Lear, we see maybe 5 minutes of Lear enjoying himself, and after that it's over.
Maybe in comedies we see dukes, who are enjoying themselves a bit, but that's about all, right? Theseus in A Midsummer Night's Dream, right, is not at war in that play, right? He's already conquered Hippolyta, and right, they conquered the Amazons and is heading towards marriage. But no, we don't. So that whole idea of being able to, it's a fantasy of power and control, right? That's the delusion in it, that any person can be so a master intellectually of events that they can manipulate them for their own advantage and manipulate their own desires for their own good, whatever that good may be. That it never turns out well in Shakespeare, ever.
Given what Shakespeare knows, and what, as you've said, he has demonstrated in so many of the plays, that this Renaissance notion of self-creation, or recreation, and it's very existentialist, actually, of of projecting your own future and then creating an identity rather than being this thing. How difficult that is to really pull it off. And he's very good at demonstrating that. He knew how hard it was, but he manages himself beautifully. He became an actor. He became an actor manager, owner, a good businessman. He bought property. He bought new place. He was the son and the grandson of Glovers. In Anthony Burgess's biography of him and in his novel, Nothing Like the Sun, his ultimate goal is to become, meaning to, in a sense, to buy his way into being a gentleman with a coat of arms. And he did it. He got his coat of arms. He was a gentleman, a man of property. He pulled it off.
Yeah, I mean, despite the disrepute in which playwrights were viewed, right? I mean, we use the word playwright today, but there's some good evidence to suggest that the word playwright in Shakespeare's day was not a term of praise. It was actually, on the contrary, it was like wheelwright or something like that. And maybe he did, of course, become a man of property, which is as close to a gentleman as you could get, right? But that's interesting. I think it's an interesting way of looking at moments in Shakespeare where he calls attention to the fact that because someone is born a gentleman doesn't mean they're gentle in the sense of having gentlemanly qualities. He points out again and again examples of so-called gentlemen, right, who are noble, right, by birth, but are anything but noble in their moral and other characteristics. So I think maybe the persistence in Shakespeare's work of calling attention to that, right, as he calls attention to it, for example, with Edmund in King Lear, right, who points out very eloquently, right, that he has all of the qualities and maybe even better qualities than his brother Edgar, but because of he's a bastard, right, he cannot be perceived or recognized as a gentleman, right, or even in As You Like It, the contrast between Oliver and Orlando, right? Oliver being the eldest brother and therefore the inheritor of the father's wealth, but Orlando obviously having the more gentlemanly qualities and the virtues, even though that, you know, within the system, right, of primogeniture, right, there would be no. He wouldn't get any of the wealth, even though his father promises him something, right? It's another example. Or in the same play, Duke Frederick, who has usurped his father's place, right? Who obviously, both of them are noble, right? But the Duke, who's been usurped, is biding his time in the Forest of Arden. I think the list could go on of various characters, or Richard II, right, who, although he's a legitimate king, does not have the qualities of a king. Maybe Shakespeare's preoccupation with this question has to do with the fact that even despite his success, right, and despite that he, I guess, sort of earns the status of gentleman, he really doesn't, right? He's a playwright. This is not an actor. This is not something that is admirable, even though he achieves just about the most you can hope to achieve in that society, not being of noble birth. So maybe there's a connection there. The persistence with which Shakespeare returns to that issue may be related to his own situation. I don't know.
No matter how many times they wanted one play or another to be performed, when he entered the court, he came in through the back door. He was a servant. James's men. He was one of James's men.
Yeah, exactly. That was the only way to do it, right? So, yeah. Right.
I once sat in on a director's section of the Actors Studio. Elia Kazan was working with a couple of young directors, and he badgered them. He wouldn't let them off the hook until they could summarize the theme of the play that they were directing in a single sentence, because he believed that it had to be that clear to understand the spine to which everything else relates, every other scene, every other character. I've heard the theme of The Merchant described as basically what we have inside the golden casket, which is all that glitters is not gold. For me, it's what my mom used to say all the time: two wrongs don't make a right. But really that only applies to what happens with Shylock, and the play is more than that. So let me do a Kazan on you and ask you whether or not it's possible to find a motif, to find a spine that applies to all of the Merchant of Venice. I know you often conceive of the plays in terms of political power, so I'm wondering if that's how you would formulate it, or if there's a better approach.
Oh, I think there's a better. In one sense, that the theme that binds the entire play together is the dehumanizing impact of commercial society on the fundamental emotional and moral bonds that keep human beings together in harmony.
I like that.
For me, draw the whole thing
I like that.
together.
I think Kazan would too. You know.
You think so?
Yeah, I think
I hope so.
I think you'd pass muster.
Yeah,
And it is, right? It really is very much about commerce from the first scene.
I see it that way. Yeah. I think the anti-Semitism question is important, but I would be more inclined to frame it by the larger theme of what commercial society, the changes that it's bringing to Elizabethan society, and that really the way in which it announces the modern world in which right, as we see everywhere, right, that commercial values are the power, right? It's not moral bonds between people that take precedence, right? I mean, we might even, if I might be a little political, see the impact of what an individual who only accepts commercial relationships might have if someone like that were to occupy the presidency, and what that actually means for compassion and empathy for those who might be outsiders, who might be disadvantaged. We see the impact of that everywhere with the Trump presidency, right? And this march to a society in which those who are most vulnerable are made more vulnerable.